I was going to wait just 2 minutes. Parking is an issue, I understand, so I'm just going to give it a couple minutes. And I have this light on, but I'll turn it off when I'm done. We good to go? Okay. All right. Well, Kamala is down the road. I'm very pleased to see so many of you here today for this wonderful lecture that you're about to hear. This event is the closing event as part of an alumni reunion of sorts that's associated, and I'm giving the context because I don't know all of you in this room. The Art History Department at UW-Madison is celebrating its centennial a year from now. And as part of this, the Centennial Celebration Committee, which I chair, decided we wanted to bring back some of our distinguished alumni, partly to celebrate their experiences, but also to help us think about the next 100 years, to give their feedback on their most impactful experiences here at Madison, and as leading experts in the field and fields that they're in, to help advise us on what we can do better. And so this morning we had a panel, and we have our distinguished lecture this afternoon, and I'll introduce the speaker in a moment. I do want to acknowledge that today's lecture has been generously supported by the Anonymous Fund at the university, along with funding from the Letters and Science Dean's Office, and also our generous donors to the Department of Art History. This lecture also has co-sponsorship from the Center for Design and Material Culture, the Department of Design Studies, and the Center for the Humanities. I am not the speaker. I am actually, as I said, chairing the Centennial Celebration Committee. My name is Andrzejewski, and I'm also a faculty member in the Department of Art History. If you're interested in knowing more about our Centennial events, please visit our website, the Art History Department. We have 2 events this spring, one in February, one in April. We'll be bringing back more alums for conversation, and we'll have wonderful lectures like this as well. But without further ado, I want to introduce our speaker, and I will introduce her formally here in a second, but one of the projects that we're doing in association with our Centennial is an oral history project, and so we've been interviewing our alumni, and I had the distinct pleasure of interviewing Marsely Kehoe right before this, and we were reminiscing about her memories, and what she reminded me of is the first session of the first day of her first class in graduate school, which coincidentally I think was among the first graduate seminars I ever taught here at Madison. And so it was fascinating because I put the students in groups to talk about definitions. This is something I do. It's why students run from my seminars, because the first week is always definitions. And Marsely found herself in a group having to define material culture separate from visual culture, separate from art history. And Marsely fondly recollected, I didn't know what material culture was, which is absolutely fascinating because, as you'll hear today, her time at Madison was transformative in shaping her understanding of material culture, both as something to study and as a set of methodologies, perhaps. And so we'll hear about that today, but it's really a pleasure. I took on advising Marsely, co-advising ultimately, midway through her dissertation. And so it's just a distinct pleasure for me to have her back here from first day through the last day, through today. So Marsely Kehoe, she earned her master's degree here in the Department of Art History in 2006, her Ph.D. in 2012. Marsely is an independent scholar working in higher education grants administration. She directed Hope College's Digital Humanities Research Program between 2017 and 2020. Her research considers early modern Dutch material and visual culture in a colonial context. I'd also have to draw attention to the fact that she is author of a recently published book entitled Trade, Globalization, and Dutch Art and Architecture, Interrogating Dutchness and the Golden Age, and it was published by the University of Amsterdam in 2023. And me being me, I was like, I'm going to read from the reviews. It's so new that the reviews have not come out yet, except for one review in the Burlington Magazine, which, as you all know, is behind a paywall, and they want you to pay large amounts to view it. So I couldn't, well, I could have, but I chose not to get it. But what it said in the teaser was like, this, is a very hot topic, ... And then I had to pay. So in any case, I think that shows you the import of Marsely's work. She is also, besides being an accomplished academic scholar of academic research, she is also co-leader of the Dutch Textile Trade Project, and you're going to hear more about that today. So with that, I'm really honored to introduce Dr. Marsely Kehoe.
Thank you, Anna. Is the mic at the right height? Are we good? Okay. Thank you, Anna, for the introduction and also for the invitation to come here and speak today. I can't see. Today, I'm going to be starting out with a kind of deep dive into a case study of our project, and then in the second half, I'm going to dig a little further into the project that this is part of. This portrait of Dutch merchant Peter Nol and his family with 2 enslaved servants is one of the most often invoked images of colonial life in the Dutch East Indies, and it hangs in the Rijksmuseum's Colonial Corner Gallery next to their Gallery of Honor, where all the Rembrandts are. We know the names of 5 of the 6 subjects, including the enslaved man, who is identified as the Indonesian national hero Surapati. It's really rare to be able to identify an enslaved subject by name, especially one whose life after this image was made is so extensively described in both European and Indonesian sources. Cornelia van Nyenrode was the daughter of a Dutch East India Company senior merchant stationed in Japan and a Japanese courtesan. Her name was Surashia. I think it's amazing we even have her name. At the death of her father, Cornelia and her sister Hester were transferred into the keeping of the orphanage in Batavia, which is now Jakarta, Indonesia, where they were raised. She married Peter Nol in 1652. They lived in the outskirts of Batavia, but this villa setting that you're seeing here among romantic topography is really a fabrication. It does not look like that in that area. This family was quite well-to-do. Peter Nol was from 1663 until his death. He was the senior merchant in Batavia, which means he was responsible for all Dutch East India Company accounts in Asia, all the different stations they had in Asia. When this was painted, the Dutch East India Company, or VOC, which is the Dutch acronym, was at the height of its enormous profitability, and this prominent position brought him wealth and status. The display here of porcelain down in the corner, of ivory, there's an ivory casket box on one of the daughter's laps, and also of textiles. The display of the meeting of Dutch men and Asian women and of slavery and hierarchy is very much a microcosm of the Dutch Empire. Briefly, the Dutch Empire in Asia, established in the beginning of the 17th century through trade, would continue as a colonial power into the middle of the 20th century. The Dutch East India Company was a major driver of the Dutch and wider European economy, importing both luxury goods like spices and porcelain and staples like cotton textiles and dyewoods. The company was also a key player in the intra-Asian market, notably moving textiles and silver throughout the region. A portrait, of course, is meant to elevate the status of the sitter by its very commissioning, as well as how the figures are displayed, turned out in their finery, idealized versions of themselves. Here, I will argue that a key means of demonstrating status is the clothing depicted, both that of the Knoll family and that of the enslaved pair. I'll evoke comparable material examples to fortify the fictional textiles painted here, as well as textual evidence about the use of textiles and economic data about the textile trade. This case study, drawn from the Knoll and Van Nijenrode portrait, is one small piece of our larger Dutch textile trade project, co-led by myself and Carrie Anderson of Middlebury College. Within the project, I focus on the Indian Ocean side of the trade, rather I focus on that, and so basically the Dutch East India Company, while Carrie focuses on the Atlantic side and basically the West India Company. How do the textiles worn by the Knoll family indicate their status? Katerina and Hester, the daughters, they wear matching bodices and overskirts in gray with floral decoration, with solid colored petticoats beneath, trimmed with gold and white lace. The floral textile is interesting, certainly referencing the types of fine pattern textiles trading on the VOC networks. Any attempt to match it with extant textiles is of course limited to what remains, but also as a painted image, a specific match can't really be made. Consider, for example, these two examples. One of them is hand-painted cotton chintz at the center, and the other is a cotton cloth embroidered with silk thread, and both made in India. I think on the screen you can't tell the difference between the embroidered one and the painted one, and certainly you wouldn't when that's translated into a painting. We could also add in a cheaper printed cotton, as well as a fine painted or embroidered silk or damask textile. There's kind of an implied texture on Katerina's bodice, so it could be another interesting weave there. So really anchoring this painting to a specific textile provides a range of potential values for that textile, from cheap to expensive. The parents, Peter and Cornelia, wear fashionable deep black outer layers, his coat trimmed with gold buttons and detailing, and both have lace collars. The sheen of her petticoat suggests that this might be a silk satin textile. This kind of luxury in dress was considered a major social problem in Batavia and the Dutch East Indies, as residents and outsiders alike noted the extravagant and ostentatious behaviors of inhabitants, even calling this un-Dutch, which is something that I dig into in my book. Batavian authorities, with the support of the Dutch government and company elite at home in the Dutch Republic, regularly issued sumptuary laws, including this one from 1680, which prohibited the wearing of the pearls and gold buttons and buckles that we see worn in this painting. This law wasn't issued until 15 years after the portrait was made, and it also wouldn't apply to a painting, but I still think it's interesting to see a clash between practice and expectation. And I also question how much we can understand this portrait to depict the specific dress and jewelry of this family and how much is idealized fiction. Incidentally, another Batavian law issued in 1665, the exact same year as this portrait, outlawed the selling of enslaved Balinese men. Surapati, if this is indeed him, was from Bali, although some Indonesian accounts say he was Javanese. Again, the link between the law and the painting is fraught. Is this evidence of a senior merchant flaunting the law, or is it just a painting? I'm less inclined to see these two enslaved figures as individuals, portraits of individuals, and rather more as kind of props to augment the status of the Knoll family. They stand in for the approximately 50 enslaved people connected to this household. Large retinues of enslaved people were another way beyond costume that Batavian society indicated status, and each of the individuals would have had highly specialized role. The honored position of parasol or standard bearer is the role that Surapati had, according to records, and here he's holding the standard, so it seems that that's why he's been identified as such. In this painting, the two enslaved figures are shown to be less important, lower than the Knoll family, by their placement behind them and to the side. They're described in less detail, in part because they are in shadow, and also she's cut off by the edge of the canvas. Even without as much precise description as we saw for the Knoll family and their clothing, the clothing of these two figures provides further context for their status and the social meaning of textiles. He wears brown breeches and a matching coat over a white shirt with plain collar. She wears a loose-fitting white blouse, and around her lower body, a wrapped skirt or sarong in red and purple. These figures are also differentiated from the Knoll family by what they are not wearing. Her bare feet are visible, and his might be assumed to be bare based on the bare calf that we see, which is, I think, a startling contrast to the blammo white socks on Peter Knoll, which is like literally a high point of this image visually. Peter's shoes even are shown in so much detail that you can see the contrasting buckles and that his heels are red, and the daughter's clad toes peek out below their skirts. So the shoes seem to be important to reference this family. A further contrast between the enslaved pair and the family is the playful connection between the enslaved figures, as he offers her a piece of fruit and she responds with a small smile, while the Knoll family is frozen and expressionless. I want to take a deeper look at the plain blouse the enslaved woman wears. Rather than simply a generic white shirt, it is specifically a kabaya, which is a simple garment worn throughout Southeast Asia, still worn today, that's characterized by narrow sleeves and an open front, which can be worn open, buttoned or pinned, or sewn mostly shut, as it seems to be here, and that produces kind of like a V-neck in the front. Jan Brandis's watercolor from a century later shows 4 women all wearing kabaya. The 2 serving women are in simple versions and also bare feet again, while the darker-skinned, fancier lady wears a longer version over a loose-fitted dress, and the light-skinned fancy lady wears a long, loose, sheer kabaya over a European-styled gown. Seen in this context, it's an indication of these women's identities as Southeast Asian women and of local practice, despite the imposition of Dutch and European practices on the region. Since this garment, in the Brandis watercolor, crosses social lines, I would like to know more about the qualities of the specific textile it is made from. Is it rough or soft? Is it lightweight or dense? Is there a differentiation between the textiles worn by the different classes represented here? The image suggests that the serving women have a less transparent textile, making up their kabaya, but otherwise we basically can see that they're white. So how do you go further after that? Many of the textiles, and I know you can't read the names of the textiles here, but many of the textiles that circulated on the Dutch East India Company ships were white. A quick search of our project's Textile Geographies app pulls up 32 textile names described with the modifier white, and 17 more that are described as bleached, so they're presumably also white or close to white. This data is several decades earlier than the Brandis image and several decades later than the Koemans image, but we could theoretically dig into each of these textiles, see which are circulating in Batavia, and compare prices to see the relative value of each type of white cloth. If I had data from the correct year in our project data set, I might go down this rabbit hole, but I will spare us all that effort today. This record of the 1665 return fleet from Batavia does fit our image. This will eventually also be included in the project data. It includes many of the same textiles which passed from various Asian ports through Batavia before shipping on to the Dutch Republic, so it provides evidence of the types of textiles available to the Knoll household. I want to draw your attention specifically to these 4 textiles I've marked and translated here, all of which are associated with the clothing of enslaved people and also could be white. We have textual evidence of white shirts issued to women in Batavia. Miki Sugiura draws our attention to the 1750 regulations for supplying clothing to children and enslaved people in Batavia's orphanage, where notably Cornelia van Nijenrode and her sister were raised. The regulations include specific mention of white or plain shirts of guinea cloth for enslaved women and for orphaned children, while enslaved men wore brown bleached salampors, which is another plain light cloth. Can we connect the 1750 regulation to imagery made in the 1660s and 1780s? Was this regulation codifying a long-standing practice or introducing a new one? The mention specifically of guinea cloth in the regulation might be an indicator of those enslaved women's status. Guinea cloth, specifically a blue and white variety, is generally connected to both the Africa trade and the perception of enslaved status, as Carrie Anderson has shown. But where does white guinea cloth come in? Our data set shows that 45% of all guinea cloth circulating in the Dutch East and West India Company networks between the years 1700 and 1724 was white, not the blue and white variety. Of these white guineas, less than 10% were destined for the west coast of Africa. Instead, much of it circulates in Asia, demonstrating that there are differentiated markets for this subtype of white guinea cloth. While the people who purchased white guinea cloth and sewed it into shirts for the orphans and enslaved women would have been aware of its texture and its drape, which may indeed have differed from other white cloths circulating on this network, we, the viewers of these images, have no such insight. Guinea cloth here, in painted or printed form, is not visually distinguishable from any other white cloth, ranging from high to low quality, from cheap to expensive, and from fine, lightweight muslins or silks to coarse, sturdy cotton. Sailcloth is another contender for white cloth worn by enslaved people, and for which we have only small material examples, so far removed from their context as to be virtually meaningless. No idea why this is like a weird little tarred roll of it, but it exists. It's in the Rijksmuseum. And the other one was from a shipwreck. Sugiura's research on cheap ready-made clothing is again helpful here. In the Cape Colony, or today's South Africa, she describes enslaved males wearing doublets that were lined with cotton sailcloth. Sailcloth, a durable and rough, white or light-colored textile, serving as a lining for a garment, is not something that would be visible in imagery. But it might be reasonable to imagine this rough, light-colored textile lining Surapati's coat. Sailcloth was put to this purpose precisely to be durable, but not comfortable, a reminder of the lower status of the enslaved men who were issued such garments. I'll examine one more textile type listed in the 1665 cargo, negro cloth, or negro cloth. In Dutch, it's negro kleden. Anna Arabindran Kessen has written thoughtfully about this textile type in the context of early 19th century America, and Jonathan Squares of popular social media account Fashioning the Self in Slavery and Freedom, he's on all platforms, he's great. He's working on a book about negro cloth across the centuries. Anna Arabindran Kessen illustrates 3 examples that she found, all very different in appearance, and she also discusses textual references to this textile that are plain or light colored, both light and heavyweight, and even ready-made clothing. How is this a single textile type, considering its range of appearances and qualities? She shows that this textile had conflicting purposes. First, to protect the enslaved from their environment in order to protect the enslaver's investment. Second, to be rough and uncomfortable and thus remind the enslaved of their status. And third, to look coarse and cheap so that others could identify a person as enslaved. Like Batavia, the early US had sumptuary laws which restricted which types of textiles might be worn by enslaved people. What seems to unite these examples is a texture, perhaps, maybe, a rough, durable, and likely uncomfortable texture. This discussion of texture is also discussed at length by Robert Duplessis in Material Atlantic. To leap forward again in time and to try and understand the texture of this textile, I've been looking closely at this photograph of a group of enslaved people in South Carolina during the American Civil War. The men all wear this kind of light-colored shirt. In the American context, it's usually identified as Osnabrück, which is either a linen or a cotton. And the 3 standing men are also wearing kind of matching dark vests. The cloth of the mid-tone pants, jackets, and dresses of the women at left and right seems heavy when compared to the drape of the men's shirts, their sleeves especially. And also the light-colored dress of the woman holding the child, which shifted during the long exposure of the photograph. So that seems to be lighter. The wind caught it. She also wears an apron that is heavy enough to remain still during the process of photographing this, but it has a sheen that suggests it might be another finer cloth. The heavier clothing worn by nearly all of these figures might be examples of this negro cloth, although certainly a plainer version than the samples on the previous slide. However, I am also aware that I am making a huge leap in attaching this textile because of its name to these enslaved Black figures. It's also difficult to see a clear connection between 1665 Batavia, where race and slavery were entangled differently than they were in the early United States. I'm going to switch to my website. Oh, I should make that bigger. I'm going to switch back and forth, so apologies if you get carsick looking at this. So in our Textile Geographies app, we can explore the circulation of this textile from 1700 to 1724, which is what data we have. And we can see, oh, let me put it in here. We can see from looking at the app that most of it is originating on the Coromandel coast of India. Some of it also seems to be originating in today's Sri Lanka. And if we zoom in here, also Jakarta. This is where the textiles are moving from. But they are destined not for those places. Most of it's going through Batavia to the Dutch Republic here. None of it is circulating out to the Americas at this point. That doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it's not captured in our data. There's also the chance that this cloth, Negrocladen, upon being auctioned in the Netherlands, gained a new name and is thus represented differently in the data. And this is one of the big challenges of this project. Back here. Bringing us back to the painting with which we began, could the jacket and breeches of Surapati be, perhaps, of a similar quality to the male clothing in the photograph? The rough, durable, and uncomfortable clothing of enslaved Americans in 1862 recalls somewhat the drab, unremarkable clothing that allows Surapati to sink into the background of the 1665 painting, a textile that by its touch reminds the enslaved and by its appearance informs the viewer of their status. With this case study, I've been aiming to demonstrate the complex methodologies we are using in the Dutch Textile Trade Project, which weave together analysis of visual and material culture and understanding of the broader cultural context to attempt to understand the social meanings of textiles. I'm drawing on information that crosses space and time, largely because non-elite fashions aren't a subject that was well documented, and this requires a creative interpretation. I'd recommend you also look at Saidia Hartman and Marissa Fuentes on creative interpretations of kind of sparse archival records. Alongside this, we are contributing with this project an analysis of data from the Dutch textile trade, which provides important nuance and even contradicts some previous research on the role of textiles in history and culture. In the second half of this talk, I'll dig deeper into the kinds of evidence we used in the project, demonstrate the tools we've developed, and share the aims of our research. And I will take a water break for a second here. In our examination of textile trade and practices, Carrie and I are primarily interested in non-elite experiences and also aim to decenter the Dutch, despite using Dutch trading archives as our primary source. The sources we use are not neutral. They were written by employees of the Dutch East and West India Companies and the Middelburg Commercial Company in order to document the financial transactions of these companies, whose aim was, of course, profit for the Dutch Republic and company shareholders. These companies enslaved Africans, Asians, and indigenous Americans. They extracted natural resources, and they destabilized local governments to force favorable trading conditions, all of which continue to impact the people and landscapes they encountered into the present. The documents they produced may seem dry. 6,520 pieces of assorted sailcloth shipped from Batavia on the 24th of December, 1664. I know it's dry. But this is evidence of the actions of these companies. It is our contention that by examining many of these transactions from a distance, we can better see the non-elite experiences that can be difficult to see in visual and material evidence, as well as find evidence of the non-Dutch trading practices and tastes of the markets where the Dutch were active. The Dutch and other European traders saw themselves primarily as rivals with one another, but in fact they were in many ways naive and bumbling middlemen in a broader global trade driven by Asian, African, and American makers, merchants, and markets. With regard to the data and products of our research, we are also committed to open sharing of the data and the code underlying our website and data visualization applications, and clear communication about our sources, processes, and contributors. We aim for true collaboration, both between Carrie and I and among our larger project team, but also with the scholarship we draw from and the future users of our project site. I began this talk with the case study of the Knoll family portrait because with our training as art historians and the fact that I'm back in my art history department, in this project we're really drawn to visual representations for how they communicate the social meaning and use of textiles, but we're also pretty critical of the representational value of these images. Material examples offer evidence of use, but the material remains of the 17th and 18th centuries are not representational of the full spectrum of textile manufacture and use. And as digital humanists, we're committed to the approach that big data will help generate new perspectives. But the textual information that is our primary source while voluminous, can be inconsistent, lacking necessary detail, and can be difficult to interpret. It is our contention that looking at these three types of data together, the visual material and the textual, with a critical eye for both their shortcomings and possibilities, can indeed generate a richer understanding of the early modern textiles and their wearers and users. This painting I've focused on is remarkable because it depicts named historic individuals about whom we have additional information from history, and therefore I'm able to speculate with some confidence about their status. Wealthy landowner versus enslaved individual, their ethnicities, Dutch versus Japanese versus Balinese, and extrapolate a broader context of local laws that relate to the clothing depicted here. But still, to create contextual meaning, I've dragged you across additional centuries and different places around the world, and the limited material samples that reach as far as 19th century machine-made cloth from the United States. Hard facts are elusive, and much of the visual culture produced in the colonial context of the Dutch Empire lacks the kind of detail that allow you to identify individuals even by ethnicity, race, or status. For example, I've long spent a lot of time looking at this portrait. Some of you have seen it, or this image. Some of you have seen it before. I've kind of scoured it for evidence of the appearance of the city of Batavia, which is in the background, and also the costumes and practices of the multi-ethnic population of this city, which was the capital of the Dutch East India Company. The painter, Beekman, was a Dutch soldier who sailed on VOC ships and apparently also had artistic talent, as the VOC hired him to paint this after his return home to Amsterdam. He had made sketches of people and places in Batavia and elsewhere on his travels who have been kind of assembled and repeated in the foreground here. As a person who actually traveled to Asia, his visual production is valuable as eyewitness documentation, but he also viewed the people and places through his own perspective, and also he wasn't perhaps the best artist the Dutch so-called Golden Age produced, and this painting was produced with some distance from his actual live experiences here. So as evidence of actual practice then, this image must be taken with a grain of salt. Yet it can also be understood in the context of laws like those that were discussed above, or implied practices like the enslaved not wearing shoes, for example. However, there's a risk of spotty evidence kind of mutually reinforcing itself. So if I identify everybody in this picture as enslaved because they have no shoes, and then I think that's proof. You can dig yourself into a hole. Looking to material culture as evidence, there are extraordinary examples from the Dutch textile trade preserved in museum collection, like the Rijksmuseum's collection of chintz or kalamkari costuming, and they also have many examples stored in their depot of deconstructed pieces of garments or remnants. This textile, chintz, was once one of the most desired Indian cottons in the 17th and 18th centuries among Europeans, but also actually around the world. It represented all that was desirable about Indian cloth. Cotton cloth was largely unknown in the European context, where linen, wool, and silk were the primary fibers, and cotton weaves up into a nice, lightweight cloth. The dyes used by Indian artisans were also exciting for Europeans because they could withstand washing in light much better than the dyes the Europeans were using. Chintz is produced in a series of steps with dye-attracting mordant and dye-resisting materials applied between dyeing stages in order to produce multicolored cloths that were incredibly time-intensive to create. The patterning could be hand-painted or block-printed or a combination of that, so there can be a range of labor costs for this textile, and then subsequently the prices can show a great range as well. There's also great examples of export chintz. The big bedspread in the center has the city arms of Amsterdam in the center and in the four corners. So that was clearly produced for the Amsterdam market. Chintz also influenced European fashions at all levels of society because a cheaper printed chintz, especially the lowest quality produced by European factories, was available at a price point so that even the lowest classes could afford it. Some evidence of that is the textile tokens all the way at the right, which were left with abandoned infants at London's Foundling Hospital, as John Stiles has written extensively on. The loss of hierarchy enabled by this textile generated great anxiety in Europe, as well as concern about European production versus importation, and also among the European powers. So there's a lot that could be said about chintz. It's a great example of a textile circulating on this market that does show us a view into multiple classes of Europeans and which has been extensively collected so that there are many material examples to examine. But even so, there are huge gaps in our knowledge of this textile and in the documentation of remaining examples. But what of the other 400 plus textiles that are named in Dutch cargo documents, especially the cloths that were used and often used up by the non-elite? Textiles which were unremarkable in their time and thus not collected, and or so ubiquitous that it wasn't necessary to describe them. Everybody knows what sailcloth is, right? No need to save any good pieces or describe it anywhere that Marsely can read it at some point. In some cases, we've been really helped by swatch books, which are, I guess, one of my current obsessions, which preserve small pieces of trade textiles that were never worn, so they're in remarkably good shape, mushed in a book in an archive. These pieces of textile have been pasted or pinned into place, and it's really convenient for this research that they're often labeled with the terminology that was used at the time. Several examples we've examined, the one on the left and at center, were both related to the European trade with Africa. The one all the way at left was definitely carried on board ship to the Guinea coast. The letter at the center, which is in the Danish archives, includes swatches and labels and a not quite clear discussion of which textiles are desirable and which are not in the Guinea trade. It's not quite clear, unfortunately. Carrie, my partner, has done some great work on how these relate to African-made and traded cloths, showing that in some cases the Indian makers and merchants were likely knowledgeable of African tastes, imitating textiles that were already circulating in the African context. African consumers, of course, were also sophisticated, differentiating between varying qualities and types of cloth. The final example is a request book from VOC employees for European silks in specific colors, but I can't tell if these samples are European examples or Asian examples. I don't have that expertise or a close enough view of these to really examine that. One of my favorite examples of the swatches is gingham, which is a textile that's still in use today and one we are quite familiar with. It's a balanced checked pattern, usually blue and white, but often white and red. It can be any kind of two-color thing. Okay, so you know the gingham, I hope. Let's see, if I go to our swatch search, this is our newest app. And look at gingham. Here. Does not look like that, does it? So here are the 9 examples that we have. These 4 are all 18th century examples, and they're all blue stripes. There's no checks. This is kind of checks, but it's also extra weird. So it's mostly a kind of a striped cloth, at least in the 18th century. Show off our tool here. Gingham 2 and gingham 3. So these 2 examples are interesting. This one was labeled ordinary gingham, and the other one is labeled silk gingham. So if this is the ordinary one, this is the perhaps most common one in circulation at the time. Again, very far from Dorothy's dress. And then this silk one, I looked at this in person, and I think maybe just the yellow and white are silk, but it's not quite clear exactly what silk gingham means and why is it called silk gingham if it's a mix of textiles. So this is, or a mix of fibers. So this is just kind of some of the trickiness that we have to work with. And this one's especially interesting. A French gingham from Pondicherry, so Indian, not French, but the French were in Pondicherry, and it has an ikat stripe in it, so completely different again. Basically, all of these examples we have of gingham look entirely different from what we think of as gingham today. So it's very useful to have these material samples because we can tell by observation and feel that these were the colors, patterns, and fibers that they were made of. And we also have dates because of those swatch books have dates associated. These have helped us enormously with understanding the vocabulary in our data, but they also suggest we need to be really careful about dates and locations, as the meaning of the term gingham has clearly changed over time and space. I want to turn now to the textual data that underpins our entire project. The Dutch trading companies kept meticulous records of all cargoes traveling throughout the world, which have been carefully preserved by the Dutch National Archives and other local archives. In addition, many of these documents have been digitally photographed and made available online. Thank you, Dutch government. And this was a huge help to us in this project, which really took off early in the pandemic when we couldn't actually do any traveling. I was first drawn to the Dutch East India Company ship cargo information when I was doing archival research for my dissertation. I was hoping to find evidence for the kind of objects that show up in Dutch still life painting, to use the one from upstairs. Well, I don't know if it's out right now. Who knows where it was. It used to be upstairs, one of in our collection here. I was really hoping that I could find good, solid evidence that the objects that were in still life painting were actual objects that were traveling on ships. Underlined, I have the porcelain marked here. There was nothing else good on this cargo list I keep showing you today. But often you do see the carpets that show up here. You see mother of pearl, other objects that are in still life painting show up on cargo lists. I had a real desire to show the relative value of imported goods at different stages of their transformation from being foreign raw materials through worked artistic objects and then depicted artistic objects. I did not do this. This was impossible, but it was my desire. Faced with 17th century handwriting, I'm sure you can also imagine another reason I was drawn to lists like this. They are much easier to read and they're so neat and easy. The goods are for the most part not actually easily translated. There's inconsistent spelling. These are a lot of kind of Dutch versions of foreign words. But after looking at a number of these, you start to see there's a pattern in the way that they organize their cargoes. So all of the cotton textiles are together, all the silk textiles are together. There's a little section of spices, some raw materials, and some finished goods. So you can understand from looking at the pattern of how they're printed that a big chunk of them are cotton. And that can be helpful for understanding what you're looking at. I kind of shelved this away in my mind, that there were a lot of textiles here, especially in the 18th century, to work on later, because with the exception of starched linen, tablecloths, and carpets, none of these textiles appear in still life painting, and you have to limit yourself if you ever want to finish your dissertation. These nicely printed lists are compilations of the goods carried on a fleet of ships arriving together in the Netherlands, and they were printed up by the Dutch East India Company as broadsheets for circulation among merchants, who would later be buying these goods at auction. And these were also reprinted in locally circulating newspapers. So it's almost like the VOC put out a press release and then the papers picked it up. This is also, I think, really fascinating because it suggests that many people were interested in these cargoes, not just merchants, and that this was knowledge more broadly held, almost like the financial section of today's newspapers. And kind of you think about today when we talk about the state of our economy and reduce it to gas prices or the stock market, this is a kind of an early version of that. So when Carrie Anderson and I first met and began to conceive of this project, she had been working on gift exchange within Europe and also between the Dutch and the indigenous of the Americas, and had seen that textiles, especially in her case, European linens, were a really important piece of this story. We had also both been trained in digital humanities methods after completing our degrees, so we were beginning to apply new methods to the materials we'd been studying for years, both seeing that a data approach could potentially be fruitful to understanding these exchanges between cultures. The printed cargo lists draw from the handwritten records kept for each journey of each ship, which were papers that were filed with the central offices of the trading companies at both the beginning and the end of the journey. So we have a lot of them still. Even if we've lost half of them, we still have the other side of it. These documents contain more than just the items traded, but also their value. Sometimes we see this in currency, sometimes we see it in trade with other goods. And in the case of the West India Company, sometimes you also see which merchant was supplying the goods to the company. We began building a data set that contains information for each item in a cargo. So it includes the archival source information, the ship name, departure and arrival port, region, and dates, quantity, unit, textile name, descriptors of the textile, like color or pattern, the total value of the ship's cargo, the value of that specific textile, and the per piece value of that textile. It's something like 50 fields across. It's really a lot. At first, we found a 5-year range from 1710 to 1715, where we had good documentation for both the East and West India companies, and we did the data entry from that, thinking it was a small little project and it would kind of give us a sense of what we could do and what changes we needed to make to our methods. I think we had something like 9,000 records at that point, so that was actually not that small, but it was worth it, I guess. Our expectation was that by compiling this data, we could take a more distant view of the information and begin to see patterns or poke questions at some of the information we'd found in secondary sources about this trade. The way we were able to answer these questions was through the development of data visualization apps. Carrie and I spent a lot of time trying out various tools for data visualization, and we had a really hard time finding a fit. Something that could handle geography in addition to our quantities and values, and also images, and also we're art historians, so we want it to look nice and not be too clunky. And cost was also a big concern. We didn't yet have any funding for the project, and we couldn't make a multi-year commitment to an expensive tool. This changed when Carrie was one of 4 faculty in a pilot course at Middlebury called Data Science Across Disciplines that was part of it's an ongoing effort that Middlebury has to build data-centered research into the curriculum. It's a 1-month intensive course where students learned the programming language R in the morning, and then in the afternoon they split into sections led by a faculty member to dig deep into a data project. Carrie brought them our 5 years of data, and small groups of students built apps to visualize the data. These were not art history students, and they had no familiarity before the class with textiles or Dutch history or art history, but they bravely dug in and produced really interesting applications, which are the root of what is currently available on our website. And I think actually the fact that they didn't know any of the material made them maybe better able to look with different perspective. When they presented their work at the end of the course, it was so exciting to see that indeed patterns were emerging, and the data set we had produced could be understood better through data visualization. Carrie repeated the class again the next winter term and has been able to hire students from these classes to refine and publish the apps, of which we currently have 3. When we launched the project website in spring 2023, we had grown our initial data set to cover 25 years, 1700 to 24. The Dutch companies were operating from about 1595 to a little into the 1800s, and we aim to eventually have those 2 centuries published. We have been able to hire 2 great postdocs, Talitha Scapers and Hannah Prescott, who have worked on the West India Company and Middleburg Commercial Company manuscript data, and I've been working on the 18th century VOC data from published and printed sources. Hannah and I are like a month away from publishing a third of that data, so that will be coming soon. The central aspect of this data is the textiles themselves, and a big challenge is that the terms that are used have little to no meaning today, as we've seen with the challenge of gingham with its changing meaning. We have more than 400 terms, and at least half of them are not defined in any glossary or dictionary. Most of the information we have about textiles trading globally in this period are from the English East India Company, but we're working on the Dutch case. The terms aren't too different, but the EIC was operating in different ports, and we've seen some conflicting information, very likely because there's regional and company differences. We expect that some users of the site will come with specific terms that they are curious about, like if they ran into that term doing research of their own, but many will be here just for discovery, exploring via the different modifiers to determine possible names for their textile, or even just asking questions, like I was earlier, about where white textiles versus blue and white textiles were circulating, to see local markets and tastes. As we explore the data, we are also producing entries for our visual textile glossary. I want to look at this one. This provides a range of information about a textile term, beginning with a pair of interactive images that are annotated here, followed by a short definition. Really difficult to actually define these things, so we try to leave a little uncertainty in that. That's linked out to the Getty Art and Architecture Thesaurus, and we're pushing terms to them, and because they don't have a lot of the trade textiles in their vocabulary. That's followed by different spelling variations, whether we know why they're spelled differently or not. There's also a list of related textiles that you might be finding connected to these. And then you have one of our apps that's queued up to that term, and you can kind of dig in and look at different aspects of that textile, and the graph will change for you. Are there cotton ones too. You can compare multiple types. I'm doing a very pointless comparison here, but anyways, you can kind of see what's there. You can download all the data that is about this textile Nikoni from here, or you can download our whole data set, and you can also, there's another place on the site you can download that. That's followed then by our interpretive essay, where we really dig into that term, the secondary literature, if there is any on it, and how it connects with our data. And that's illustrated with examples, as you see here. It's meant to be short, but it's hard to be short when you're an academic, so we do our best. And then those are authored by individuals. So here, Carrie, but both of our postdocs have also authored these. And then we have a gallery of images that are related, some of which have been illustrated earlier in the entry, and some of which are additional, and then everything's footnoted. I would like to conclude by acknowledging how many people have supported this project beyond Carrie and I. We launched this project alongside a special issue of the Journal of Historians of Netherlandish Art, for which we commissioned 6 essays exploring the data or its context. In the spirit of collaboration, which underpins our project, we wanted to offer a showcase of other scholars' projects and work, and we mentored 2 junior scholars whose first publications were these. The Delmas Foundation supported our initial website build in conjunction with this issue of the journal, where they also did some improvements to the kind of digital capabilities of the journal so that they can host other projects like ours. The Crest Foundation provided the rest of the funding for starting the website and to hire our 2 postdocs, and Middlebury College has supported our outstanding student workers who built the apps. This project is ongoing. More data and years are coming, many more terms to research and publish. We will be seeking more funding, and we also welcome any feedback or suggestions, and if you know of any swatches or samples, we'd love to add them to our collection as well. Thank you.
I assume you also have questions.
Yeah.
Try to repeat the questions as they come.
Tom.
A really wonderful talk. I like the way you wove together the material evidence, the depicted evidence, the documentation of the shipments and things like that, and also the way you're creating an accessible database that then other researchers can build on for their own interpretive work. So my question is, I'm wondering, it's very simple, just I've been working on some related material for my medieval Venice project, and something I came across unexpectedly was that wills contain an awful lot of useful information about material culture. And I was looking initially into documents about enslavement, the Phoenician Roman enslavement, but then I came across in these wills almost by mistake that there was all this other information. So my question is are you also able to explore other kinds of evidence, not just the evidence of what is shipped, but on the recipient end, in Dutch communities, what is left behind, what is recorded in terms of inventories, and what that tells us about this complex interchange that you're documenting.
For the people online, the question is, are other documents like inventories and wills being used to kind of look at the larger context of these textiles? We are looking at those, but we are not using them as part of our data. We had to limit ourselves to one kind of question at a time. So there are definitely a lot of Dutch examples of textiles in inventories and wills. I mean, these are the most valuable things people owned. I just love seeing a list of, an elite home where there's a couple Rembrandts and they're worth a little bit, and then they've got the one dress worth so much more. And I love seeing how that kind of flips the narrative about the importance of textiles. But yeah, there's great examples. The Amsterdam City Archive has digitized many inventories, so they're available online as well, to really kind of understand this context. And they are useful because they say things like, this is what this is valued at, and gives you a sense of how people use things as well, yeah.
Because I was surprised in the documentation I was looking at that they even mentioned in the case of the
Yeah, it really gives you a strong sense. I think Sophie has a lot of knowledge of some of those documents as well. I don't know if that's what your question's going to be.
My question is not, but I'm happy to talk about the whole chapter, and I have the same feeling as you. Like, it's amazing how you see the kind of, the, not just the economic value of these textiles and other things, but the kind of emotional resonance of them too. My question's jumping into a totally different question, which is about users. I mean, I love your, I love your database. It's amazing, and it's been, really celebrated, prize winning. But I wondered, like, how much you know about the people who are using your data set and what they're doing with it. And if you could talk about how it's being used.
Yeah, so the question is, do we know about our users and how they're using the site? We only really know that through feedback. You can contact us through the website, and we've gotten a lot of questions from kind of small collections. The Blanket Museum of Leiden has reached out to us. Leiden made blankets, and different people who are either in possession of collections and they've come across a term that they either wish was in our data set or that they found it in our data set and need more information. We've also heard from some researchers who are working in different areas of the world and have a term, and they're like, well, I don't see it there. Have you come across this? So we're getting mostly research questions. But we did hear from the mother of a Dutch art historian. Her weaving friends have been exploring our swatches. And I guess they're playing with the imagery. So I really like that as kind of a material example. But yeah, I've been kind of struggling, since this is part of a public humanities couple of days, thinking about who my public is here, because it's not the whole public. It's clearly textile nerds of different colors and varieties. But yeah, so we're mostly just kind of getting that feedback as we go.
And are VOC scholars using it?
None of them have contacted us specifically about it, so yeah, they might be. I would love to see a project. These are the kind of things when you're applying for more grant proposals, you're like, how can I pull people out of the woodwork? How can I shift the project a little bit? Because when we did that special issue of the Journal of Historians of Netherlandish Art, we really wanted to see how a scholar could use the project. And we also use them as kind of user experience as well. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
In the still life from the chasing that you showed, there's that textile on the corner.
Oh, yeah.
Do you know where that one may have come from?
Oh, it's right there. The question is, do I know where that carpet is from? I don't. There's Persian carpet people who can do it a little bit better than me. Right near.
I think it's not Persian. It might be Turkish. I'm not sure. It's Turkish. Turkish, yeah. Absolutely not Persian.
Yeah. Oh, Anne.
I'm working, as you know, I'm working on this project in the 1750s in Virginia, which is sort of the other part of this chain that we're working so beautifully on. And working for a whole account book of stores, and 400 different kinds of objects. And the majority of them are textiles. But I'm thinking about your question about Osnaburg and slave clothing, because a very big part of this work is Osnaburg and the enslaved. And there's actually some good literature on that, which you may know about already. But one of the things my friend Douglas, in his autobiography, talks about when he was a child, and he was enslaved actually in the same county as my account book. He talks about how awful it was to be given these clothes. It was out of tote. You know this? And he describes how awful it is because it was so scratchy, so horrible, and his brother took it and wore it for him to alleviate his pain.
Wow.
So which I love that idea of how do we think about how uncomfortable and how awful some of these basic textiles might have been. So I think that fits beautifully with your idea of looking at the photograph and trying to discern what it felt like to be like to have these lesser textiles. So I'll look forward to talking more about, because Osnaburgs were originally made in Germany, and then they got picked up and made in England, and there's lots of discussion about the name and the quality and all that, but that's a little way
Mm.
So I'm looking forward to talking more with the Fabulous website as we've seen.
Thanks. So Anne's asking, well, talking about the account book that she's been working on that has the American side of this story. So it's a merchant or a shop selling a lot of textiles and other goods together, as well as the account of Frederick Douglass is his uncomfortable clothing. So it is really fascinating to read, and I'll point you to the people who are working on slave cloth and Negro cloth, because they're really kind of digging into this. I feel like I spend much of my time just looking at spreadsheets and not actually doing any secondary reading, and I guess it's one of the things I try to do is kind of be somewhat agnostic about meaning as I'm working, because I don't want to bring too much interpretation to it as I'm building the data out. That's my excuse for remaining somewhat ignorant of all of the contextual information. But
There's a new, you may know the Hulkin album.
mm,
Yeah, you know that.
yeah,
Which we have a library here.
I just thought it was out on a table earlier. So
I returned.
okay.
Yes, so another great research, another great, and it's basically a Frenchman who has been hired as a spy to go spy on English makers of textiles and creates a swatch book so he can go back and copy them in France, which is just a marvelous story of industrial espionage.
Yeah, I mean textiles, they're important, right? Yeah, Jill, yeah.
Hi, I was wondering the painting that we started with, because I thought maybe we might go back to it. Do you know what it's on? That is it on, is it panel painting or is it on?
I think it's canvas.
Canvas?
It's large, but not this large.
So, I mean,
Yeah.
retrospectively, as somebody who came in, at least in theory, under the banner of visual culture, and I think I'm still not sure what the difference is between visual culture and material culture, but I was definitely trained in the moment in which what seemed really liberatory was this idea of an image, and to lift off from the material support and to think instead of how images move across individual objects. But in this moment in which we're most of the time working through various forms of virtualization, it feels especially important to rematerialize things. And in doing so, from this moment, looking back, it feels really strange to paint on fabric. Why would you do that? That this is painting fabric on fabric feels like something to think about and think with, and what kinds of effects you can get in rendering fabric in and on fabric. And I don't know if that's something that interests you at all, but and this is also coming from somebody who did some research once upon a time on French 18th century ideas of Dutch painting, which was very much a caricature of these little paintings that circulate like currency and maybe circulate like textiles. Anyway, so that was a long-winded question of just having now spent a lot of time with the textiles. I'm wondering what else we might be seeing here and be able to say about paintings like this one that are such a virtuosic performance of rendering textile, using textile.
Yes. I'm going to do a very short version of that into the microphone of the kind of meta qualities here of an image of textiles painted onto a textile support, and how that textile itself also moved. The canvas textile moved to Amsterdam, because I don't know, but I presume this was painted and hung in the colony and then brought home at some point. Yeah, it's a really interesting question of kind of these layers of meaning that are really fascinating to look at. I've been kind of focusing on all of the different kinds of Duke, D-O-E-K, which is canvas, I guess. But so sailcloth is Zeildoek. There's translating on the fly, like room cloth, door cloth, like all of these different cloths that I think are all kind of industrial heavyweight things, of which what we think of canvas could be one of those or not. And a lot of those are being carried in rolls on ships. So yeah, the connection between the surface on which a painter works and the way that they render a textile upon that. And then also I think in there was the question of the difficulty of rendering a smooth, like damask cloth on a rough canvas as well. It's really a big challenge to kind of get at this really, yeah, multiple layers. And as Tom said earlier, the weaving together, it's impossible to not have puns when you're talking about textiles. It's like, especially textiles around the world. It just, yeah, there's a lot to work through there, yeah. Anna, yeah.
Maybe this is bringing us back to this morning slightly, but you've accomplished a lot in a short period of time. I don't remember quite when this started, but you know, the pandemic, you had some time, clearly. And I think the fact that Sophie said she was using this is really interesting to me to think about, but I'm wondering about you're sort of between big data and art history, like you're operating this space, and I'm wondering about your strategies going forward for selling the project to art historians or textile historians or publics, and selling it to the big data people, because I imagine there's probably skepticism in the big data world about this. So how do you navigate that space?
Yeah, the question is, how do you navigate art history and data and getting this material out to people that might find it useful? Like today, we're live streaming this,
Yes.
so, for instance. We've gone with a kind of organic route. I think it was definitely deliberate to have a journal issue that launched with this, because that gave us a lot of publicity at the same time. But yeah, we're hoping to be discoverable. I think part of the issue is that we both have full-time jobs, and so we're trying to kind of navigate, when do we have time to do any of this work? Carrie is on sabbatical all year in the Netherlands, so she's going to be trying to set up one-on-one connections with people. One of the authors that we worked with for our special issue works for one of the Dutch research institutions, so we've made sure that they know about it as well. So kind of trying to do this. We're also, the other thing is, I felt initially discomforted by having a partial project to put out there, that, you know, I want to do the whole thing, but the whole thing is going to take decades, so that's enough to make you just kind of curl up and stop working on it. So part of what's actually worked out well methodologically here is that we're doing it in small increments, so that we can have time to take feedback if we have the opportunity for it, and we can kind of move at the pace that we move. So I had a good chunk of time last year where I wasn't working, and it was really nice because I was working on this instead. I highly recommend quitting a job if you want to get moving on a research project. Really frees up your time. But yeah, it's nice because the pace doesn't really matter too much. Yeah.
I have two logistical questions, which is, first of all, in terms of accessing the records in the Netherlands, are you just utterly reliant on people there who've already digitized things? And then the second one is about data entry. Are you able to use language recognition, or are poor undergrads typing in different words and different numbers?
I wish we had poor undergrads. So the question was all logistical about, like, how do we access our materials, and then how is it getting entered? So the Dutch government put a huge effort into making all of the Dutch East India Company, a lot of the Dutch East India Company documents available. There's like over a kilometer of shelf space for it. So they've had to be somewhat selective. But they've definitely made sure all of the West India Company documents are available, and the Middleburg Company documents are all scanned, because those are the companies that were involved in slavery. So in the kind of Dutch effort to somewhat apologize for their past, they've at least made the information available. So a lot of it is kind of happenstance that we're able to get those documents. And they've, just poured tons of resources into making those available. Their interface is really annoying, but it exists, so that's really handy. In terms of data entry, it's more me and my postdocs who are typing it. And I have asked a few undergrads who I had in the research program, I'm like, would you like to be involved in a digital humanities project? You don't really need Dutch because it's typed, and none of those words mean anything anyways. And all of them were like, that sounds horrible. So there is some language recognition software that the Dutch are using. Those, actually the wills and inventories that I mentioned, a lot of them have been used for that. But it's kind of a generative process. So like their tools for reading manuscript get better. So every once in a while we kind of check in and type in a few of our vocabulary words and see if they show up. And so far, no. But you can often find proper nouns and names that way. But yeah, so endless is the answer. Yeah.
Kind of like related to the question about like names and terms. Yeah, because we know that Dutch usage in that company their product like circulate around most country like other than Dutch, most of Japan, China. I'm wondering, like, the terminology, like the vocabulary you are using in the site, because, like, sometimes maybe it's like called maybe Negro club, but maybe it's called another, like a cheese, maybe called salsa in Japan.
Yeah.
Like this kind of different terminology. How did you decide, like, ping on one terminology instead of another? Sorry.
Yeah. No, it's a great question.
Yeah.
So the question is dealing with the multiple spellings and the multiple versions of different things, how do we standardize the spelling? And yes, so actually Sarasa is chintz, but in the Japanese context, and we have it as two separate things in our data set. So we were talking with a scholar and I was like, can you help me dig further into this, because I do think of these like 400 terms, there are ones that mean the same things in different contexts. So what we've done is when we do the data entry, we enter in the term as we read it on the document, and then as we're tidying up the data, make some educated guesses of what seems to be similar. Like in Dutch, there's always these IJs, sometimes they're Ys, and they're all the same. But when they're close, but we're not sure if it's the same textile, that's where it gets tricky. There's cellos, chiles, and another vowel version of that. The consonants are all the same and the vowels are all different. And so we try to be conservative and keep them separate if they seem separate. But then when we've decided a group of terms must be the same term with just variation, we've kind of tried to pick something that's somewhat pronounceable in English, even though they're kind of Dutch words, because I think English is going to have more availability to connect with scholars in different places. And this is also one of the challenges of working globally is the languages that Carrie and I have are Dutch, Portuguese, French, Italian. So we can really only work in those languages. And we really need to be connecting with scholars across the world. So that's kind of the future effort, is to find other scholars and have them write up the vocabulary entries so that we can really bring in other perspectives. Because I think there's a lot that is out there that we don't know. Yeah. It's Friday night.
It's Friday night.
Happy hour.
Nice. Well, thank you so much again, Marsely, and
Thank you.
thank you for being part of this. And on your way out, grab an Art History at 100 sticker. I think it's on the chair.